I want to tell you about the day a pair of cufflinks told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in my own son's life. It started at a rehearsal dinner I helped pay for and ended with a silence so complete it felt like a door being locked from the outside. But before we get into it, tell me where you're watching or listening from today. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. It was a Friday evening in October and I was in the spare bathroom of my house in Decatur, Georgia, trying to get my cufflinks in. Silver ones, oval-faced with a small compass rose engraved on each. I bought them myself 20-some years ago at a shop on Peachtree Street when I closed my first real contract with the city. I wore them the day my son was born. I wore them to his high school graduation. I thought it was fitting to wear them the night before his wedding. My hands weren't shaking from nerves. They were shaking from something harder to name. Pride, maybe, or something that used to be pride before it learned to be careful. My son's name is Owen. He was 29 years old that October, finishing up a residency in orthopedic surgery at Emory. Smart, disciplined, the kind of young man who makes you feel like you did something right, even when you know you barely held it together some years. His mother, my ex-wife Carol, and I split when Owen was 11. Not ugly, not pretty. Just the long, slow kind of ending where two people realize they've been roommates for 4 years and finally stop pretending otherwise. We shared custody. I had Owen every other week, every summer, every holiday that fell on an odd year. I was there. That's the thing I need you to understand before anything else I tell you. I was there for all of it. I drove him to swim practice at 5:15 in the morning when he was 13 and wanted to make the varsity team. I sat in the bleachers at Druid Hills High School with a thermos of bad coffee and watched him shave tenths of seconds off his backstroke. I helped him study for the MCAT at this very kitchen table, the one by the back window that looks out on the yard. He'd sit across from me with a highlighter behind each ear and I'd quiz him from the prep book until one of us fell asleep first. Usually me. I co-signed his medical school loans when his mother said she couldn't. $212,000. I remember writing down the number and staring at it for a long time. Not with regret, just with the kind of clarity that comes when you understand that love is a verb, not a feeling. His fiance's name was Paige. She was from Alpharetta, her Paris, her father in particular. A man named Mr. Hutchins who made money in commercial real estate and had the firm handshake and the monogram blazer to prove it. Had opinions. Strong ones. About the venue, the caterer, the seating chart, the rehearsal dinner location, the honeymoon itinerary. From what Owen told me in passing, Mr. Hutchins had been involved in the wedding planning the way a general is involved in a campaign. I didn't mind. I wrote my check when Owen asked me to, and I stayed out of the details. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant called Sable and Oak in Buckhead. Private room in the back, exposed brick, Edison bulbs, the kind of place that puts a small card on the table explaining where the arugula was grown. I wore my good suit, the charcoal one, and the cufflinks. I got there a few minutes early and found the room. Owen was near the bar with Paige and a cluster of her family. He saw me and smiled, real, not performed, and came over and hugged me. We stood together for a moment, the way fathers and sons sometimes do when they're running out of years to be cavalier about it. Then Paige's mother found us. A tall woman with a kind face and a lot of bangles on her left wrist. She introduced herself as Linda and shook my hand warmly and said, "We've heard so much about you," which I took as a good sign. She turned to check on something across the room, and I looked at the seating arrangement on the small placard near the entrance. The head table seated 8. Owen, Paige, her parents, her maid of honor and her fiancé, the best man and his wife. I looked for my name. I found it at table 3. I stood there reading it twice. Table 3 was against the far wall, with Owen's college roommate, 2 of Paige's cousins from out of town, and a woman listed only as Aunt Vera. I thought there had been a mistake. I actually thought that. I went and found Owen near the bar and touched his arm. He turned and I asked low, just between us, whether there'd been a mix-up with the seating. He looked at me for just a second too long. Then he said, "Dad, it was Paige's mom who set the tables. The head table is just immediate family. You understand, right?" I looked at him. He looked at his drink. Immediate family. I rolled that phrase around in my head the way you roll a stone around in your hand, testing the weight of it. I had co-signed $212,000 in loans. I had been at every swim meet. I had been the one at the kitchen table with the prep books and the bad coffee and the highlighters. I said, sure. I went and sat at table 3. Aunt Vera turned out to be a perfectly nice woman from Savannah who raised orchids and had strong opinions about the best time of year to drive to the North Georgia mountains. I listened to her. I ate the food. I watched my son at the head table from across the room, laughing with his future father-in-law, the two of them leaning in over some shared joke, Mr. Hutchins with his hand on Owen's shoulder like he'd been there the whole time. I drove home alone that night. The 400 South was quiet after 11. I had the windows down a little, even though it was October, because I needed the air to be doing something. I thought about the seating card. I thought about the phrase, immediate family. I thought about the swim practice in the dark and the MCAT books and the loan papers. I didn't call Owen. I didn't send a text. I just drove. The wedding was the next afternoon. Church ceremony at a chapel in Roswell. Reception at a venue outside on the grounds with white tents and a string quartet, and the kind of sunset that makes everything look like a photograph. It was beautiful. I will give it that. I sat in the third pew on the groom's side, and I watched my son stand at that altar and make promises, and I felt something so large and so complicated, I don't have a clean word for it. During the cocktail hour, I found Owen for a moment alone near the edge of the tent. I straightened his lapel the way I used to, straightened his collar before school when he was small. He let me. I've got something for you, I told him. I reached into my jacket pocket and held out the cufflinks. The compass rose ones. I told him where I'd bought them, what I'd worn them to. He looked at them in my palm and his eyes did something. Got quiet. He took them and turned them over in his fingers and said, Dad, just that one word. He hugged me and went back to his new wife and her family and the photographer who was waving everyone together for pictures. I wasn't in the family portraits. I found that out later when Paige posted an album online and I scrolled through looking for myself. There were 43 photos. I appeared in 2, both candid, neither labeled. I went back to Decatur that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Not angry. Anger comes fast and burns out. This was something slower. The kind of feeling that settles in under your ribs and doesn't make a sound. Just wait. I had a financial advisor, a woman named Priscilla who'd been managing my accounts for 11 years out of an office on Chambly Tucker Road. I called her Monday morning before I called anyone else. I told her I wanted to review some things. She said, come in Thursday. I also had an attorney, a man named Gerald. Wait, I need a different name. A man named Philip, sharp and methodical, who I'd worked with on estate documents years ago. I left him a voicemail. I had been quietly setting money aside for Owen for 20 years. A brokerage account, not a formal trust. Just contributions I made when I could, when a project paid well, when a bonus came through, when I refinanced the house and had a margin. By October of that year, it had grown to something just over $400,000. I'd never told him the exact number. I thought of it as something I'd hand over when the time was right. Maybe when he finished his residency, maybe when he and Paige bought their first house. I hadn't decided yet. On Thursday, I sat across from Priscilla in her office and told her I was restructuring my estate intentions. She listened carefully the way she always does, head slightly tilted, pen resting between 2 fingers. I'm not leaving him nothing, I told her. I want to be clear about that. I'm not cutting him off out of spite, but I've been operating under an assumption about my place in his life that the last 2 weekends have corrected. And I'd like my estate to reflect what's actually true rather than what I wished were true. She asked if I was sure. I told her I'd been sure since I read a seating card in a restaurant in Buckhead. Philip drew up amended documents the following week. The brokerage account, which had always been informally earmarked for Owen, I redirected. Half went into a charitable remainder trust, designated for a scholarship fund at the high school where I'd coached youth swim league for 9 years. The other half I left liquid, with new beneficiary designations to my sister and to my nephew, who was working his way through a mechanic certification program in Macon, and could use the leg up. I didn't tell Owen, I didn't tell Carol. I didn't tell anyone. I went about my life. Took a consultation job advising on infrastructure contracts. Started getting up early again. Made coffee and drank it on the back porch, watching the yard do whatever yards do in November, which is mostly go grey and let things fall. Carol called me in early December, which was unusual. We were cordial but not frequent. She asked if everything was okay. I said yes. She said, Owen mentioned I'd seemed distant at the wedding. I told her I hadn't been distant, just present in a particular way. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know how Paige's family is?" "I do," I said. "I do know how Paige's family is." She asked if something was wrong between me and Owen. I thought about how to answer that. "Nothing is wrong," I said finally. "I've just done some recalibrating." She didn't press me. Owen called me the first Sunday of the new year. He and Paige were back from their honeymoon. They'd gone to Portugal, which I knew because I'd seen it on the photo album online. And he said he wanted to come by. Have lunch or something. He came on a Saturday. Paige didn't come, which I noted but didn't mention. He looked good, rested. Marriage agreed with him at first glance. He sat at the kitchen table and I made us plates and we talked the way we'd always talked. Easy and unhurried. About his caseload at the residency, about a patient who'd had a complicated tibial repair, about the rain they got in Lisbon. At some point, the easy part ran out. He said, "Dad, I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." He looked at the table for a second. Then he looked at me. He said, "Priscilla called me. She said you'd made some changes to your estate documents and asked if I was aware." I told her I wasn't. He paused. "I just want to understand." I let a moment go by. "You want to understand," I said. He nodded. I asked him if he remembered the rehearsal dinner. He said yes. I asked him if he knew where I'd been seated. He was quiet. I told him anyway. Table 3, against the wall, with the college roommate and the out-of-town cousins and a woman named Aunt Vera who raises orchids. He said, "Dad, that was Paige's family who arranged." I held up one hand. "I'm not finished," I said. I asked him how many photos from his wedding I appeared in. He didn't answer. I told him. 2, both candid. I asked him whether he'd introduced me to Mr. Hutchins before the ceremony. He had not. I asked him whether he'd told Paige's family before the rehearsal dinner, before the seating chart was made, that his father had co-signed $212,000 in loans and had been at every swim meet since he was 13 years old. He was quiet for a long time. I wasn't looking for an apology, I told him. I wasn't looking for a scene, but I had been operating under the impression that I was your father, not a historical footnote, not the man who used to be around, your father. And some things that happened at that wedding told me I needed to update my understanding of the situation. He said, "That's not fair." I told him I agreed. It wasn't fair. It hadn't been fair since I sat down in that seat at table 3 and looked at the back of his head from across a room, while another man put his hand on his shoulder. He looked like I'd said something in a language he was still translating. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse. I refilled my coffee, and I sat back down and I looked at my son across the same kitchen table where we'd done the MCAT prep 12 years ago, and I said, "I love you. That has not changed, and it will not change. But love doesn't mean I get to pretend I didn't see what I saw, and it doesn't mean the decisions I make about what I've built are anybody's to question." He asked about the brokerage account. He'd clearly talked to Priscilla more than she'd let on. I told him I'd redirected it. He asked where. I told him. The scholarship fund. His cousin in Macon. He nodded slowly the way people nod when they're trying to absorb something that landed harder than they expected. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I should have said something at the rehearsal dinner. When you told me about the seating, I should have fixed it right there." I didn't say anything. He said, "I didn't want to make a thing of it in front of a family. I thought you'd understand. I thought..." He stopped. "That's what I thought too," I said. "That you'd understand. Every time for 20 years. I thought you'd understand without me having to say it, the way I always understood without you having to say it. And it turned out we were both wrong about that." He stayed for another hour. We finished lunch. He helped me clear the plates. which he'd done since he was old enough to reach the sink. When he left, he stopped at the door and looked back at me in the way that young men sometimes look at their fathers. When they're trying to remember something they're afraid they've started to forget. He said, "I'm going to fix this, Dad." I said, "I know you are." I watched his car back out of the driveway and turn onto the street and disappear behind the oak trees that line my block. I went inside and stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking at the yard. The account is still redirected. I haven't changed that. Not out of punishment and not out of stubbornness, but because some things, once you see them clearly, don't benefit from being unseen again. The scholarship fund made its first award in the spring. A girl from the swim team going to Georgia State to study nursing. I didn't put my name on the award. That wasn't the point. Owen and I have lunch most months now. He comes on Saturdays, usually without Paige, though she has come twice and been perfectly pleasant both times, in the way that people are pleasant when they know they've been caught not being it before. We are finding our way back to something, and I won't pretend to know exactly what it is yet, but it is honest, which is more than I can say for the version we had before. I still wear the cufflinks. He still has his pair. Whether he wears them, I don't know. I haven't asked. There's a thing my father used to say when I was growing up in Columbus. A quiet man who worked for the railroad and chose his words the way other men choose tools, carefully and only when needed. He used to say, "Son, you can love a person completely and still require them to see you. Those are not the same thing and they do not cancel each other out." I was 63 years old before I understood what he meant. It took a seating card at a restaurant in Buckhead and a wedding album with 43 photographs to teach me. If you have ever been the person who shows up for everything and gets thanked by being treated like a footnote, I hope something in this story sits with you the right way. You are allowed to require people to see you. You are allowed to make decisions that reflect what is actually true, rather than what you have been hoping will become true. That is not cruelty. That is clarity. And sometimes the clearest thing you can do is not yell, not threaten, not demand, just quietly redirect what you've built toward people who already know your name. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Leave a comment and tell me what you think, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to Voices of Uncle Russell. I'll be here. I keep thinking about that seating card, a small white rectangle in a brass holder, printed in a clean serif font. Table 3. My name next to a woman named Aunt Vera who raises orchids. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It just sat there telling the truth while everyone around it was too busy celebrating to notice. That's the thing about consequences. They rarely arrive the way you expect. People imagine them as dramatic, as shouting and door slamming and grand confrontations in the middle of a restaurant in Buckhead. But the real ones come quietly. They come as a Monday morning phone call to a financial advisor. They come as amended documents in a manila folder on an attorney's desk. They come as $400,000 finding a new direction, toward a girl on the swim team heading to Georgia State, toward a nephew in Macon who earns what he gets. I didn't read that account to punish Owen. I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the only thing I still have that nobody else can arrange the seating for. I did it because I finally had the courage to let my actions tell the same truth my eyes had already seen. For 20 years I've been making decisions, co-signing loans, driving to early morning practice, sitting at that kitchen table with the prep books, based on an understanding of my place in Owen's life that turned out to be mine alone. When the wedding showed me that, I had a choice. I could pretend I hadn't seen it, the way I'd been pretending for years every time something small told me to pay closer attention. Or I could be honest, even when honesty costs something. That's what I've come to believe about integrity. It isn't what you do when someone is watching. It's what you do when no one is watching, and everything in you wants to keep the peace. The easy thing, after that rehearsal dinner, would have been to go home, swallow it, show up to the ceremony with a smile, and never say a word. I know men who've done that. I understand why. But there's a kind of slow erosion that happens when you keep choosing comfort over truth, and by the time you notice it, you've lost something in yourself that's hard to name and harder to get back. Owen is smart. He has been smart his whole life, the kind of mind that can hold complexity, that can work through a difficult diagnosis or a hard conversation if he chooses to apply it. But intelligence without the willingness to examine yourself is just a faster way to rationalize what you already wanted to believe. He knew what happened at that rehearsal dinner. He knew where I was seated. He made a calculation, the way young people sometimes do when they're trying not to disturb the peace of a new life. And he chose not to correct it. I understand that. I don't hate him for it. But understanding something is not the same as accepting the cost of it. What I learned from all of this, and I don't say it lightly because it took 63 years and a seating card to teach it to me, is that the people who love you are not guaranteed to see you. Seeing someone is an act that requires something. It requires the willingness to be inconvenienced by their reality. It requires a kind of moral steadiness that doesn't bend when the social stakes get uncomfortable. Owen is finding that steadiness now, slowly, the way people find things they should have looked for earlier. He comes on Saturdays. We talk. We are building something honest out of the parts that held. My father was a quiet man who didn't waste words. He used to say you can love a person completely and still require them to see you. I think what he meant was this: love is not sufficient on its own. It needs to be accompanied by something with a spine to it, by the courage to say even to someone you do anything for, "This is what I saw and I will not pretend otherwise." That is not hardness. That is what it looks like when a person finally decides to take up the space they actually occupy, no more and no less, and stop apologizing for the size of it.